Welcome to my teaching learning session of Foundations of Psychology. I'm Sonal Singh Pawar and taking care of your psychology courses and BA programs. Like we continued in the last time memory sessions, we continue with memory and memory registers this time too. Last time we studied an Atkinson-Shiffrin model that spoke about that we comprise of three memory registers. Three major memory registers, to just give you a recapitulation of how them is, there was sensory, STM and LTM. STM stands for short-term memory, LTM stands for long-term memory. So we have three basic memory registers. Sensory memory is the most fragile and the most smallest memory that you have, all the information which are falling from the sense organs. And when we talk about STM, that's the short-term memory. Something that's going on right now is the short-term memory that we have. And the long term is everything that you store to retain, store to recall. For your examination, information while you're writing is coming from the long term memory. After that, we come to another level of processing, which was given by Craig and Lockhart. Craig and Lockhart gave this model coming in terms of critique to the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. They stated that our memory registers do not process in terms of the three registers that we have, like as sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, but they register information and the processing gets better if the recall is the most deepest. So we have three levels of recall according to Craig and Lockhart. This levels of processing, which is also called as LOP, was given in 1972. And the process stated that we have two kinds of processes involved. One is called the elaborate rehearsals, two deeper rehearsals. So we start from something which is shallow. After shallow, we come down to intermediate levels, and after intermediate level, we come to deepest level. That suggests if you learn something at the shallow level where information is very less about the content or about the thing that you're reading, it's going to be lost very early. Similarly, if you learn something till the intermediate level, which is the middle level, we can be saying that the middle level can allow you to retain information longer than the shallow. And if you take it till the deepest level, which is the last level, the information is retained for a longer duration. So, in contrast to the Atkinson and Shiffrin model, long term memory was the deepest level. But Craig and Lockhart criticized that model, saying that the processing has to be of levels, three levels. So, let's understand the three levels that we have. The first is the physical and structural processing, where the information is coded only in the shallowest way, which is the structural way. Like, let's take an example of psychology as a term, psychology. So, when you are just learning the term psychology, the spelling, that's called the structural level. So, probably if you've heard the term for the first time, you might forget the spelling, you might forget the correct pronunciation. Why? Because you are just learning the term on the structural level, which is the spelling. Let's come to the second level we have. For example, if we go from the structural level to an intermediate level, which is called the sound, the phoneme. How does it sound to you? So when we talk about that, we will learn to understand the pronunciation time and again. That it's called psychology. Psychology. That is called phonological process, which is the sound, the encoding of the sound, breaking the word into parts and hearing it and then getting it together and hearing it. So it's all phonological, which is the sound thing, the pronunciation of the word and how it sounds when you're using it in different pattern, like psychology, psychological, like that. Now let's come to the deepest level. For example, now you understand the meaning of what is psychology. You understand what is psychology called, what is its meaning. It's the study of the mind and soul. So when you understand an information on its semantic level is word meaning level, the processing is the deepest. So when we say the processing is the deepest, that means you are going to retain it for a longer duration of time. The recall is going to be far better than the level of shallow level, which is just the structural part. And also the deepest level allows you to take in information in a very word meaning pattern. So a pattern which you've understood, so it will be retained, it would be staying in your memory registers for a long period of time. In relation to Atkinson and Shiffrin model, where the levels of processing are not given, just the connection between the registers were given. So this image will support you to understand the same. The shallow level, the intermediate is the orange, and the deepest is the pink one. So this is where the shallow is just the structural emphasis, where you see the content, you just read it out. Intermediate is understanding the words and the sounds of the words and the content of the word. When we read aloud is something which is intermediate level when while you're learning and reading aloud as children, and deepest level is understanding the word meaning. This finishes the LOP of the memory as one of the most well-known theory after Atkinson and Shiffrin. Now let's come to understand working memory. Working memory is exchangeably also called as STM. So when we talk about STM is the short-term memory, and it was stated that short-term memory is initially was called the storehouse, but later most of the studies disapproved this fact. They started saying that short-term memory is not something which is just a passive storehouse. Passive storehouse, something that you take in information and keep it for a while. So this suggests that there is no manipulation, there is no learning, there is no editing in the information. So this thought was again disapproved. They stated that working memory has an ability to manipulate, has the ability to learn, comprehend information that goes down, and also at some point of time, this limited capacity allows you to make changes in whatever that you've learned. Now, this was also a concept which was given by Badley and Hitch in 1974, just after the levels of processing. They stated that from the idea of level of processing, they got to know that STM is just not a passive storehouse. It is something which is called as a working memory. Working memory is a kind of memory which is functional right now. So the time that you're looking at my lecture or my session is the working memory. Like as per the Atkinson, Shiffrin, Modern, what would be working memory? Working memory is a passive storehouse. Whatever that I tell you, you just take that information and retain as a rote learning information. Something you rote learned the information and you make no changes in the information. That means the content that you've learned, you'll always apply it as it is. There are no manipulation, there is no application, there is no integration from the other content which is coming in. This is what that was disapproved, that it is not a passive storehouse. We make sure as soon as the working memory, which was later called as working memory, allows it to manipulate information, make integration like newer information coming in, making changes in the older one. So this concept came out from the LOP model itself, which is called the levels of processing. Also, we need to know what is the feature of the working memory. It's very short term. The information stays here approximately for 10 seconds to 30 seconds. And if you manipulate, if you see this information, if you attend to this information will move to the long term memory. Now, there are reasons why working memory was given a term by Baddeley as the working memory, because there are three reasons for this. They stated that working memory allows to be a central executive. So they say as soon as the information come to your senses as, let's take an example, I'm taking your session, you can see me, you can hear me. That's the sensory information. That information goes to your sensory register. This register now will make the information move to the STM. The fact you find the information important, you find that it's making sense to you, it's relevant to you, you will make this information shift to something which is the working memory, which is also called as the short-term memory. Now, why is it called the central executive? What is happening inside this memory? It is just not keeping the information but doing a lot of changes. The changes are here in the picture. We call it a central executive because it has a phonological loop, an episodic buffer, and a visual sketchpad. That means as the information comes from the sensory memory to short term, which is the working memory, as soon as it comes inside the working memory, you start listening to that information again and again. There are primary acoustic stores. So that means you start associating to all the words that you have in the information. So working memory is like, I'm sure, something that you've heard for the first time. You might associate it to working and memory. So this is like you start reading it, you've heard these information. So articulation as a process is very simple because working memory is a very familiar word. Now the episodic buffer. You go back to your episodes in life and see that does this associate to working and memory? Can I understand in terms of any sort of episodes that you had of working and memory? And the last is visual spatial sketchpad. So when we talk about visual spatial sketchpad, that says you start imagining that information. So your senses has that inner scribe. You start writing it in your mind and you start visualizing it. So working memory is very manipulative. It manipulates a lot of information that comes in by sound, by meaning and memories, and also by the way they look to you. That's why this is how the central executive factor and that information functions and move to your LTM. That's why it is suggested that STM is not a passive storehouse, but a very manipulative working memory aspect of STM. So this is what this working memory as a very contributive model came up after the NOP as suggested. After this, let's move to something which is the types of memory. We have various types. So your memory does not come out to be in one kind, but there are various kinds of memory. So all the information that you're taking in, all the information that you are learning and probably you witnessing it every day, they do get clustered into different types. Let's start with the first one, semantic memory. Semantic ideally means word meaning. The word semantic means word meaning. But here it understands to the knowledge of the word. It's a general knowledge memory. So let's take an example of something which have any knowledge that cannot be changed down, something which are facts, a music album which has already been there and now it will not change. The lyrics will not change and you remember it. That's called as semantic memory. It's also called as general knowledge memory. This memory tends to do the same thing. It takes in the information, stores it, organizes it, and keeps it in your mind for a longer duration of time. So they keep it as facts, like the prime minister of the country for the 5 years. It will keep that information like that, and also any sport activity, any record made in sports would be a general knowledge too, which will come down to semantic memory. Then we have sensory memory, and we've already understood this. A sensory memory is also called as fleeting memory. The reason it's called the fleeting memory because it is very short lived, very fragile. It impacts our perception and it's the first part of perception. So when we say it's the first part of perception, that suggests that our perception starts from senses, which is sensory organs. So all the information which are falling onto your sensory organs, which could be audition, visual, it could be the touch, the taste, anything that falls like that is called the sensory memory. It's very short-lived, fraction of seconds. If it's not attended, it it is lost as soon as possible. Then we come to something which is episodic memory. These are memories which are stored in your mind, or probably when you witness the information, it is stored in the form of episodes in your mind. So this could be something which is a life experience which you've had, an experience of life which you remember. That's called an episodic memory. Like let's take an example. You went to an event and that event was very, 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 very amazing, and you enjoyed it. Let's take a concert that you enjoyed in the past. I'm sure that episode is a life experience. You enjoyed that episode and you remember it in respect to time. That I went in the month of January, it happened at this point of time. Similarly, some bad events which are not really good, are not very pleasant. Probably, a fight with an individual that you remember, and you remember the entire event as an episode with respect to the time that I had a fight in the month of July, and it was this time, and this was the entire event. It is always remembered in terms of episodes. So this is called as episodic memory. Then we come to something which is called autobiographical memory. It's like the term autobiographical. It is a collection of past events or personal experiences. It could be anything. A huge collection of past experiences and personal experiences of an individual. Our autobiographical memory is generally very, very accurate. Why? Because it's our autobiographical memory. It's something which is about you, so it cannot be incorrect. It has to be accurate. Similarly, sometimes when we are influenced by information and events happening outside, we also end up constructing this kind of memory. So keep making changes. Usually, it happens with when we are writing information which we are collecting of other people. Then that's the time that you start constructing this and make changes in the autobiographical information, which is probably past events. Ideally, it is very accurate because it's about ourselves. Also, sometimes we end up constructing some new events in it, like we start making some changes, which is possible in autobiographical memory. Then we come to something which is called false memory. False memory is also defined as a mental experience that is mistakenly taken as vertical and representation of an event. So, vertical means the verbatim that we take from people. So, false memory could be, like it's been stated, that at times, it is happening. It is also called a pseudo memory, a memory that is very vivid and very emotionally charged. Something that came as a usual impact on the individual, and that event has now too many things, too many emotionally charging thoughts, feelings, and action. So because of that, it becomes very vivid, or probably it becomes very there are glimpses of that information. So what happens is, now this mental experience that you have, this could be a representation of your own verbatim. So at times when you keep repeating these verbatim time and again, There could be that you keep making changes in them because it's very vivid. There are glimpses coming of that event, and there are a lot of emotions, a lot of feelings which are accompanied. So what can happen with every recall, this memory keeps changing, it keeps adding. That's why it's called as false memory and pseudo memory. Why? Because of that feature of it being very emotionally charged. So it has too many emotions in it. Probably an event that has involved a lot of grief, a lot of pain, a lot of hysteric mood at the same time. So probably as many number of times if you remember it, it keeps changing. So that's why it's called a pseudo memory, and that's why it is termed as false memory. And the last is called as flashbulb memory. Flashbulb memories are also again very vivid memories. They can be very accurately understood in terms of flashbacks that come of an event. It could be quite accurate. As I said, it's quite accurate. That means it's not 100% accurate. It's like an event that just happened in front of you, and you remember that vivid image, and you recall the entire memory on the basis of that one image. That's why it seemed to be preserved like a flashback. Like, let's take an example: the way a bulb is on, put on, and put off. So the on is like the flashback, vivid image and memory that you have, and it goes off. So it will always be remembered as that flash of bulb. So that's how it's called, the flash bulb memory. So that completes with the types of memory that we have, and we have two more exceptional kind, which is called as declarative, which is also called as explicit, and non-declarative. This is also a kind of type of memory, but mostly something that is in control and not in control. So it is defined on the basis of what you can control and what you cannot control. So when we talk about declarative memory, which is called the explicit memory also, it is referred that the memory system which can be consciously controlled by you. So this is an information that you are completely aware of, an information that you know, a complete record of information that you have, and it involves an effort from you while you recalling, because you have an entire sketchpad of it. Visually you remember it, phonologically what event happens, so you remember everything. So you remember the intent. A lot of effort will be required to consciously move this information out. Now, on in opposite to that, there is something which is called non-declarative. Non-declarative is implicit memory. Implicit memory is something that you completely don't have an awareness of. You do not know this information in your memory system. So it works unconsciously. No effort is required. You do not intend to take that information out because you do not know what this is. So let's take an example. You met a new person, and there is something that clicked you, and you said an information which was important, important about you, important about the context, and you were unaware of it. There was no effort which was required to get that information out in your conscious level, but it just came without any intention. That is called as implicit memory. Something that you're not aware of at the moment, and it suddenly comes out and pushes out. So that is non-declarative and implicit. This does have types. One is conditioning. Conditioning is something that we've done in our prior sessions that we did. Conditioning was instrumental in classical conditioning. So you need to know, once those conditioning tends to happen, those things come automatically. Those things become a part of you. You do not, like, as I give when we were doing classical conditioning, we know as soon as the bell of the school class period rings, we know the class period is over. So it's an automatic response. As soon as the bell is rung, you move out of the class because you know the period is over. So that is something which is made you learn through conditioning. So that is again an information and a memory which is completely unconscious, happens automatically without any intent. The other is called priming. Priming also works unconsciously. It helps in speeding up a process of retrieval. So because of priming, you are able to just speed up the process of retrieving a set of information. Let's take an example. You have an exam. Because of priming, let's take an example. You're sitting for a psychology exam only, and that to a foundation of psychology. And you are doing the first evolution of psychology. So suddenly, priming will support in terms of information that comes unconsciously. Okay, this is structuralism. There is this person who is responsible for it, and some very intricate details comes out. That there was a method called introspection, which you can go without also, but you suddenly are added onto it. This is priming. Sudden information which comes and flashes in mind unconsciously is priming. Conditioning is already learned information, now is conditioned to you. Motor and procedural memory is also kind of implicit memory. This is like learning a bicycle and a car. Once you've learned it, it becomes a motor skill. It becomes embedded in you. You do not sit in a car by again and again stating, okay, now I need to sit, now need to put the hand gear down, I need to put on the keys and step on the clutch, put off the accelerator. You don't do that by verbally telling yourself, because it's a motor skill now after a year or 2 years. Similarly happens with the cycle. I'm sure everyone have learned how to cycle long back, but if you sit back on it again, will you forget it? No. The information will unconsciously come back to you. This is what is called a procedural or a motor memory, which becomes a skill embedded in you. So these were another two last types that we did, which was declarative and non-declarative. After this, let's come down to another information, which is called forgetting. So when we talk about something as memory, memory's major process are to take in the information, store it, and retrieve. So similarly, that's what you do. During your examination, you learn the information which you're encoding, you store the information, and then you retrieve. Forgetting comes into play when it's an inability that you are not able to recall the information which is already stored, which is already there in your memory system. So it's like you've already encoded information, you've stored it, but you are unfortunately not able to recall it. You cannot take out that information anymore. That's the process of forgetting. Forgetting, on the other hand, was a concept which is given by a German psychologist named as Hermann Ebbinghaus. He did huge large number of experiments were conducted. Number of experiments were conducted on user population. So the sample that the experiments were taken was huge. That means it was not only Euro-American, as I always said, psychology was always conducted in Euro-American, but it was conducted on the entire population on different set. So why was this experiment conducted by Hermann Ebbinghaus? He conducted to understand that what kind of information do we remember more, and how does forgetting take place? When is the time that forgetting is maximum, and when is the time that the forgetting is minimum? So he did an experiment by taking CVCs. What are CVCs? CVCs are consonant, vowel, consonant. So a term which is like VAK, which is consonant. Anything which is without the vowel in our alphabetic thing from A to Z's are something which is consonant, and anything out of the five vowels would be consonant. So excluding the five vowels, the entire alphabets are consonant. So it's consonant, vowel, consonants were taken, and they made a list of 10, and syllables like NAK, POX, these are all CVC's combination. This was taken and it was given to a large number of population, and before that Hermann Ebbinghaus did this experiment on him itself. So it was a very self-devised experiment that he did, and he found out a Ebbinghaus forgetting curve into it. So when we speak of Ebbinghaus curve, I'll just show you the picture, you'll understand. As we see, remember the 100% of learning, retention is there on the first one day. So remember, the first day, your retention power is like 100%. You remember everything. As soon as the one day is getting finished, by the time you're reaching down to the second day, remember 60% of the information is gone. Also, it is stated, I've not mentioned on the screen, you can note it down. The first 8 hours is very crucial in the first day as you learn. As you see in the curve also, the 100% is lost within the first day. So 80% of information remains on the first day, 80 to 75, because the first 8 hours is the maximum amount of forgetting that takes place. So your maximum amount of forgetting takes place in the first 8 hours. By the time you reach to 2 hours, by the time you reach to 2 days, remember it's already 50% of the information is gone. And remember, by 7th and the 8th day, which is a week, only 23% of information is retained. So remember, the maximum amount of failure happens in the first 8 hours according to the Ebbinghaus curve, and also the 8 days takes away information if it is not rehearsed. If you rehearse the information in between, the retention will be good. So Hermann Ebbinghaus forgetting curve told us the first 8 hours are very crucial for forgetting. In the first one day, we forget approximately 30 to 35% of information, and by the 7th day, we tend to forget, approximately 80% of the information if it is not rehearsed well. Now, after Hermann Ebbinghaus, there were many people who came with the theories of forgetting to tell us that there are some reasons of forgetting. So the first is the most, something which was the most accepted theory, which was the theory of interference. Theory of interference stated that forgetting occurs because of interference in the memories. So any interference that happens in your memory system causes interference. and that causes forgetting. So there are two kinds of interference. One is called the proactive, which is also called the pro forward. You'll remember it like that, and that'll be easy to remember it like that. So proactive is forgetting of the new information. Proactive, the forward one, forgetting the new information because of the previously learned information. So as soon as you take a new information, the older information starts coming in between. That okay, this is similar, this information is quite tricky. So the older information starts giving its impact, and you're not able to learn the new information. So that's why it's called proactive. Then there is retroactive, which is backward, which suggests that forgetting occurs because of the previously stored information due to the new information that's coming in. So now you're forgetting the older information because of the new information that you're getting inside. So retro means forgetting old, proactive means forgetting the new because of old. So that is the proactive and the retroactive interference. I feel this is one of the most used theory. Theoretically, it has higher claim, and it was found to be the most accepted also at that point of time. There was no critique given on this theory. It is widely accepted. And after this, there was another theory that came up that we will move to. Hopefully, the theory of interference is very clear to everybody. I'll just repeat it again. Forgetting occurs because of interference of information, proactive and retro. Pro means that you forget the new because of the older information in the memory registers. And retroactive means that you forget the old information because of the new information that you're taking in. Now let's move to the other theory types. One that we talk about is the trace theory. This theory ideally came out in 1958, which was the first theory before interference, and it was not widely accepted. It stayed on for a very less number of years with us, which is it was not further practiced, not it is theoretically given to us, but not practiced further after 1960s and 62, 63. This theory proposed that there are some changes in your central nervous system. So it has some aspect of, physiological theories, physiological functioning of your body also, a part of it. It says that central nervous system leads, whenever you learn something new, there are changes in the mind. So there are changes in the mind because your thinking, reasoning is getting better. At the same time, it says as soon as you take in new information, there is change in the brain structure also. So your neurons, runs faster probably, and there is a lot of new chunk of information getting inside your brain. We are talking about the brain, not the mind, the physical system brain. So nervous system leads to some formation of memory traces. These are physical changes that you've brought in because you've learned something new. Now, when these memory traces are not used for a longer duration, what will happen? You don't use something which is with you. You tend to forget. Isn't it use disuse? So if you don't use something, it will get disused, and you'll forget it with the passage of time. So they were stated these memory traces was also called as engrams by Brown in 1958, and he stated that if you do not use a particular kind of information which you have learned for a longer duration of time, it will fade away. So it will lead to forgetting. But there were no research. We don't know, do we really have engrams? We really don't know, does it really lead to fading of information? Also, age is another factor that comes into play with the Brown's theory of trace, decay theory. So things decay if you don't use it. So it was like that. Otherwise, it's very acceptable in terms of understanding and learning it, but it was not acceptable in terms of its theoretical understanding and scientific, empirical research was not there. There was no scientific research on it. So let's come to the other one. This is called the cue dependent forgetting. I feel this is something that we experience every day. Like forgetting occurs because of the absence of an important cue or presence of a very important link to that information. So studies have also suggested that participants, when given a hint or a cue about an information that has to be recalled, they tend to recall that category better. So let's take an example. There is a paragraph given. You need to learn an entire page, but your teacher tells you to circle the most important factors. They become the cue. So if you only remember the cue, you're able to recall the entire paragraph or the entire page. Similarly, in the absence of cues or poor cues available, you do not tend to retrieve and recall information better. They suggest that the physical attribute of the environment also plays a positive role in retrieval. Like some environmental cues also become a part. So, like, let's take an example. Your mother has given you a list of things, and in that list of things, there are 5 items, and she's told that this is another bakery, this is another confectionery, this is another grocery that you need to go in. And as soon as you go to the environment, you see all of them together, and you tend to pick up everything there. So, that is something which is called as the Cue dependent forgetting. It tends to happen. It tends to happen because of the factor that as soon as you do not have a cue, link, or a hint, you tend to forget the information. That is called as the cue dependent forgetting. Now, let's come to the last one, which is called the encoding failure. This is the most simplest, and I feel students are something that they go through. If you do not encode the information properly, that is, if you do not register an information properly by learning it, you're going to forget it. So if you're not learning well, if you do not take in the information on the sensory register as well, the result in it will result in failure way too often before retrieval. So retrieval is like the last thing: encoding, retention, and retrieval. If you do not encode it well, you will not store it well. If you do not store it well, I'm sure you will not be able to retrieve it. So try that. If you take in my sessions today and you understand all of these types and the types of forgetting that we have done, if you do not go back and you relearn them and read them, trust me, there would be something which is forgetting from the first level of the memory process, which is encoding, that will happen. So these were the types of forgetting theories. Let's just go back and understand them again. That we have. First was interference, that we said. The reason that I've quoted it first is it's one of the most accepted by psychologists, interference. Interference of two types. One is proactive and retro. That means interference of some kind of information is happening. So proactive is new information is lost because of the old. Retro is old information is lost because of the new. Then we come to trace decay. Trace decay theory is something which is not widely accepted anymore. People suggested we do not have an empirical research behind it and a scientificology behind it. We have not tested it much. So they stated that there are engrams that are formed when you tend to, when you are able to learn something new. So there are not changes only in the mind, there are changes in the brain also. So the changes in the brain are called as engrams. And Brown stated as soon as these engrams are not used for a longer duration of time, what will happen? It will lead to forgetting. Simple. You do not use an information, it will lead to its disuse. Then cue dependent. Dependent states that some cues which are available helps in retrieval. So if there are no cues and hints which are available while you're reading, while you're learning, there are high possibility that you forget the entire content. Last is the encoding. Encoding is something that children actually do. When you rote learn everything, when you quickly rote learn without making an effort of understanding each step, and you're rote learning one step, reading aloud without the meaning, you're not encoding it well. You're not retrieving, you're not storing the information, and once you do not store the information well, you tend to forget it. So that's something which is called encoding failure that we have. So this completes with the different kinds of theory. There could be retrieval failures, there could be something which is decay theory. Also at times we also have motivated forgetting, which is repression. This is a concept by Sigmund Freud, which you can find on my picture. This stated that the forgetting happens because of motivated forgetting, which is you motivatedly make sure that you don't want to remember that information. You repress it because that information is guilty, that information is painful. That is called as a process of repression. Let's move to now techniques. Remember, when we are talking about memory and we are forgetting things, don't we want to know that, don't we want to make sure that we retain information better? Why does forgetting needs to take place? Why do we need to forget things time and again? So there are some techniques that helps you improve that memory as in it will help you in terms of remember things better. So there are four techniques, memory techniques, which everything is based on. Some methods which the techniques are based on is process of meaning, retrieval process, meta memory, and distributed learning. Would suggest if the process of meaning, if you focus on the meaning of the content, forgetting will not happen. So isn't it very similar to encoding failure? Do the opposite of it. Encode it well, memorize it well. So that's what is called the process of meaning. Then we call it retrieval. Retrieval means while you're retrieving, make sure you do not have any disturbance in between. You are not sitting at an area. The reason, your examination are happening at areas which is a very quiet examination rooms. We make sure there is an invigilator and there is no talking happening so that your retrieval is an easy process and without distraction. Then there is meta memory. Meta memory talks about making a plan of action, becoming aware of the knowledge properly, aware of the knowledge properly, stacking of information, making categories. So doing a lot of plan of action, sequencing, timetabling to your information so that you can reflect back that this is how I learned the information. Probably form categories, form classification systems. So while you categorize a topic into 2 3 parts, you'll remember it better. Like if you're studying memory, understand memory has theories. Those theories tells us that how memory functions. Then memory tends to forget. What are the theories of forgetting? And then when we forget, we want to take care that we don't forget. So we improve the memory by some methods and the techniques. That's how you classify and categorize a topic. That's how meta memory happens. It's metacognition, better thinking, reasoning, problem solving. Then we come to the last, which is called as distributed learning practice. It is a superior thing. It talks about do not cram anything. Make sure you have distributed practice, which is you learn, you read, you write, you involve the memory in every part of practice, which is while you read, you're focused, while you write, you are focused, while you learn, rehearse it, you're focused. So it's like distributed learning practice means that every part where you are utilizing the content and the knowledge has to be practiced again and again and learned better. And it has to be not crammed, not rote learned. Nothing has to be rote learning, nothing has to be crammed. No inferior ways should be used for learning. So that is distributed. On the basis of this concept, there were some techniques which helped us in making our memory efficient by reducing failure. So it is not in terms of improving memory but also reducing your failures of retrieval. So it will take care that forgetting is less, retrieval failures are less, and information is received properly. So these techniques are called as mnemonics. Mnemonics, it's with an M is silent, it's called mnemonic, and too many of them are called mnemonics. Mnemonics is a strategy which will help you reduce your memory failures. It will reduce your process of, slow down the process of forgetting and improve your memory ways of taking the information in. So they are coming in 2 ways. One is mnemonics using the images, which are, a way that you use images and learn something. And then there would be mnemonics using organization. So let's first come to mnemonics using images. Images is a method of loci. Loci is, pronounced as loci, which is S is missing. It's loci. We can also call it loci and also call it loci. And its plural is called locus, which refers to position in place. A very simple method this is. This method uses a particular location to get familiar. Let's take an example. Loci is location. Let's remember it like that. Your keys have a particular position in the house where you place it. Your clothing, your shoe, your proper documents which are very important, probably education or your parents' documentation of ITR filling, their work profile documents. They have a specific position. So whenever they want to go for a specific thing, they go to that place. That's called location of a familiar place becomes a cue for retrieval. So that place becomes a cue for you retrieving information. That's called the method of loci. Then let's move to the keyword method. Very simple. This is simply learning a method in terms of dividing it into any two pieces of information linked using images. So let's suppose this example given on my screen also. You want to extend your vocabulary of English and you come with the word called squad, and which stands an angry bird and tempered expression. So in this method, when we're talking about, this is very appropriately used as learning for a foreign language. Let's take an example. I'll give you an example of foreign language learning keyword method. Like scowl can be used as for another language to learn, and probably scowl can be used that it is something which is an angry word. Pronounce it in a way that you remember it. It's like the keyword method. Also, it could be used in a second way for foreign languages. Like the word becomes a key for another language, or it becomes the key for another word. Like in German is a foreign language. January, February, March, April, May, June, July. This is something that was that the months of the year are. There it's called January is called Januar, February, Mars, April. So see, the pronunciation is almost the same. It becomes easy. Also, when we talk about 1, 2, 3 in German, it's ein, zwei, drei. So it's 1, 2, 3. The pronunciation also the keyword ein, zwei, drei. So that's how it becomes the keyword. So January becomes the keyword for Januar in German. So that becomes a keyword to remember another language better. That is using images. So you form an image, you remember that image, and you learn it. Also, method of loci is also image where you locate a situation, locate a particular place for a content, for a thing, or for an object. Now let's use mnemonics with organization. We used it in terms of something which was image. Now let's use mnemonics by organization. How can we use mnemonics as an aid for retrieving information? See, organization means you are some making changes in the content. You're probably dividing the content. You are maybe dividing into two and learning or associating them into chunks. So when we talk about that, organization means it improves the ability to learn and retrieve information accurately by applying the process of reorganization, some categorization or clustering. Chunking is one of the most famous and one of the most easiest way. Let's take an example. You want to learn a telephone number 9810839050. You divide it to 9898108, divide it to another chunk 390, and then another chunk as 50. So you divide it into three chunks that you have. So that is chunking. That's why also, our telephone numbers are given in terms of STD codes first and then the chunk. You divide the number into chunks of two and threes. Chunking is a very useful method. You can use it in terms of your knowledge of content that you're reading and learning. For numbers, telephone numbers, a lot of things can be, you know, can be used to be remembered with this aid called chunking. Then let's move to the first letter technique. This says that the first letter of each word represent an entire terminology, an entire word. So it could be the Vibgyor, the example I've given on the screen. Also, it could be a phrase that you understood. I'm sure the planets initially, when we were young, were learned that my very educated mother just showed us 9 planets. So M is Mercury, very is Venus, E educated is the Earth, and M is Mars. So this is how you learn by the first letter. So it's acronym sort of a thing, which can also be the best example is Vibgyor, and the other could be a phrase used to learn the first word of all the phrases, all the terms in the phrases for the planets. So this is something which is another most useful technique. Children use it, also adults use it. Adult make acronyms to remember their major chunk of information. We will use acronym in one of the personality theories, so I will hope that you remember this method, which is the first letter technique. Mnemonics are very famous, very useful as you find here. You can check out the images. See, we also have a sound mnemonics, which I just gave you. My very educated mother just showed us 9 planets. That's like a rhythm. You can also associate things. Association could be of colors or could be of people. Association could be liking somebody and then learning because of it. Chunking is for phone numbers, digits, paragraph, acronyms, and method of loci. So, as the image suggested, mnemonic devices are very useful. It's an aid in retrieving information quicker and reduces forgetting also. Now, after we finish memory, we move to a new content which is called motivation. So, see, we understood in the last time we started learning, major chunk of mind, we understood memory. Now we move to another major chunk which is called motivation. Motivation is what? It is an individual's, it's a need. It is a need within an individual to do something or fulfill a desire. So motivation is always an impending need that you fulfill, right? Until you will not have a need, you will not have that motivation to fulfill that desire. So goals are made on the basis of need. If you make a goal which is irrelevant, you will never be motivated to complete it. Now, a huge lot of information we need to learn on this page is that is the motivation cycle. Motivation cycle is something that tells us that how does motivation and the completion of a desire happens within us. So motivation starts with the need. I'll show you the picture and then we'll understand that how does it happen. So cycle tell us that we have a need. There's a deficiency of something, a lack, a deficiency of a need that drives us. Driving is it stimulates internally. We need to complete it. Externally also there could be forces. Let's take an example, examination. You want to score well. That's like an impending need. I want to do better. So for doing better, you want to score well. Scoring well is again moves to a drive. You are stimulated by your teachers, by your parents, and by your friends, probably by yourself also. That drive arouses you. Gives you an activation. I want to do something. What I will that pushes you towards the goal. So it makes you do a goal directed behavior. You work according to the timetable. As soon as you're able to work, are aroused and you tend to move towards the goal directed behavior, you move according to your timetable, there would be a balance that would be strong. So when we talk about a balance will be suggesting that when we talk about balance, it will be suggesting that now because you are doing a goal directed behavior, your needs are getting reduced, the deficiency is getting reduced. So as the deficiency is getting reduced, there would be a reduction of arousal. The need is getting completed. your arousal is getting reduced, and you're moving towards achievement. And as soon as you're with the goal directed behavior, you give your paper, which is reducer of arousal has happened, you've given your paper and you score amazingly. Need gets finished. That is achievement. With achievement, the needs gets completed. Now, the cycle is always moving like this. One need gets completed, we have biological need of thirst. You feel thirsty, you are driven to pick the bottle externally. You move yourself, you're aroused to quickly go towards the bottle. You start drinking, goal directed behavior, arousal, the body relaxes, arousal is less, the achievement is done, and move to another need, probably food now. So this is how you're motivated for everything: biological needs, psychological needs, social needs. Every motivation, every motive moves through these cycles in social, in psychological, and also in something which is called as physiological. Now, there are three terms that we need to always understand. Needs are a biological part which is impending, which is deficient. And drives are a state of tension that pushes you to do something. That do. You need to be aroused. It urges you to, relieve that tension, so that will arouse you, push you. Incentive is it's a, this is incentives are always external, coming from the environment. It as opposed to the drive as being internal, this is external. Incentives are like getting a pat on the back as soon as you score well, so that will include and play a very important role in motivating behavior. So remember, motive is something that will be driven, you'll be aroused, you do a goal directed behavior. As you do the goal directed behavior, the arousal gets reduced, you achieve something, and needs get completed. So this is how our motivation cycle gets completed. Now let's come down to types of motives that we have. Something which we have as biological motives, these are something which is basic to us: hunger, thirst, and sex. These are basic bodily needs and bodily motives that we have. And psychologists say that they actually leads to homeostasis. If you do not complete these needs, they will not lead to restoring balance of the body. Why? Homeostasis is like, let's take an example like my picture suggests. In the times of winters, you wear woolen clothes to retain the balance and keep your body warm. Similarly, you drink a lot of water in summers, which is right now, and that leads to sweating in the body. If you dehydrate it, you will not sweat. You will not sweat. The body will keep warm. It will give you more heat. It will give you no homeostasis. The balance will not be something which will be restored. So this is something which is homeostasis, which is a biological motive included. So homeostasis is the goal of biological motives that we have. What are the different types? Hunger, thirst, and sex motivation. See, hunger is something which includes as soon as there is a trigger, there's a hunger pang that comes to us. We tend to move towards hunger. Also, at the same time, remember that hunger pangs leads to increase the person, when the person uses too much of sugar or glucose, it causes hunger pangs. Also too much of sweet, that's why you might have noticed that after eating something very sweet, something which is very high in glucose, you want to drink water. So that is something also which causes hunger pangs earlier. Also need to know that hunger is stimulated and activated by hypothalamus, which is a part of your central nervous system. It was suggested by researchers 1976, when then there is change in the metabolic functions of the liver. The food is less, then also it initiates hunger. So liver also plays a part. When your metabolism is very fast, the food is less in the body, it initiates hunger pangs. Similarly, thirst is a biological need. How does thirst function? We need to know there is an ADH hormone, which is antidiuretic hormone, plays an important part in regulating the water balance. So when there is a reduction in fluids in our body, the water moves out of the cells. So, as soon as you're feeling dehydrated, you're not drinking too much of water, what is happening? There is a reduction of waters in the cell, the body fluid is reducing. Now the water moves out of the cell to the fluids. This causes dehydration. This dehydration in the interior part, which is interior part of the cells, which are called osmoreceptors, now sends messages to the nerve cells. The nerve cells moves in the brain. This information from the osmoreceptors goes to the brain and it initiates thirstiness, and we drink water. This is first. And the dehydration, the loss of water from the osmoreceptor, this process is called cellular dehydration thirst. So when you are dehydrated, the cells of the brain sends information, the body of the cells send information to the brain, and the cellular dehydration process gets completed. And there's another one which is called hypovolemia. This is another process when there's an enzyme called renin, which is secreted from the liver. And as soon as it's secreted, this causes dehydration in the body. and the dehydration urges you to drink water. So there are two pathways of thirst that we have. Then there was something which we have, which is paramount of our lives to let our life keep moving. We keep procreating, which is called sexual motives. These are also a physiological condition, a biological drive, also required for homeostasis in the body. If it is not initiated, remember excessive presence of hormones can lead to too aggressive behavior, and this homeostasis is struck by the gonadotrophic hormones. For male, this is regulated by testosterone. For me, females, it is regulated by estrogen. If you have too much of testosterone, too much of aggressive behaviors will happen. If there is too much of estrogen in women, too much of emotional, impulsive behavior will happen. So, making sure that this is satiated, sexual drives are there in our body. That completes with biological motives telling us motives are there to maintain the homeostasis of the body. So, goal is homeostasis. Let's move to another. What do we have? Psychological motives. Like biological, there are psychological motives that we have. These motives do not arouse from internal body. It arouses from your life. It is a part. It's you're born with it. To explore the world, to satisfy um, our need to enjoy the environment, to meet challenges. So these are innate. They tend to persist throughout our life. It will be present throughout our life without getting any changes in the body. So it is not associated to the body, it's rather associated to the world around, the social environment around. The first is exploration. This is a very important need. Exploration is a motive where an individual is very inquisitive to search around, to searching the environment, knowing about new people. So as soon as you meet a new individual, you're very curious to know about them. There's a sudden urge that comes in the body that pushes you, drives you to talk to that person daily, talks to know them daily, to explore them daily. So that's because of the exploration motive, which leads to curiosity, because of that curiosity in human mind. Then we have competence. Competence is extremely important to master achievement. Without competence, you will not hold challenges. You will not master life. You will not, move towards achieving a goal. So this is also known as an affectance motivation. Affectance motivation is a tendency to explore and influence one's environment. You want to achieve because you want to have an impact on people. That's why it's an affectance motivation. The other is self actualization. This is very close to people. This is a kind of psychological motive which a person wants to achieve to reach to its highest potential. Self actualization itself means to reach to a highest potential. These are psychological motive. We all need to have them. And after that, we come to something which is social motives. We all are social beings. We cannot survive without them. So they're extrinsic, they are not intrinsic. They are learned through peers, parents, family, society. It's learned through them. We do not survive without them. This is achievement motivation, which is psychogenic. Achievement motivation is also a part of something which is, your psychological motive, but it's only a part. It is not a huge motive there. Here, achievement motivation motives talk about a need to accomplish a goal. Why do we want to accomplish a goal? Because we want a status in society. That's why achievement comes into play. Affiliation is a need to make friends, be affiliated to a group, a usual paramount. It's very paramount for us to be associated to a group. We cannot survive without friends. We cannot survive without being affiliated to an organization, to a system. So we seek cooperation. Aggression also is a motivation, the need to fight, make your point. And these are ways you express your need to be accepted, need to be seen. Nurturance is the need for care and love. Dominance is the need to, dominating people, influencing people. Politicians has this a lot. And then there is a power motive again, which is reflected in terms of gaining power of people. Dictatorship was about dominance and power motive, which was a social need. Social media, where influencer comes into play, are dominating us because they try to influence our way of life. We want to look like them, be like them, wear like them. That's domination. And power is something where we want to gain out of things. We want to feel powerful of people. This is political system that comes. That's how today things have been. So that's again a power motive by us. We also want to be powerful. We take a status which is very high in our group to dominate people, which is influence them and also gain power out of them, gain out of their livability. So this is cogenic motive, which is social completely, extrinsic nature. We all need it. It's all coming from outside. Now let's talk quickly out of some theories. I will continue this from the next time also, but I'll quickly give you an introduction. When there is motivation, we understood we have a cycle. We are not motivated like we feel motivated and we do something. No, there's a need. an impending need that drives you, that urges you to do something. That urge pushes you to arousal. That arousal leads to goal directed behavior. Goal direction leads to something which is what do you call this? Towards reducal of arousal. So as soon as you do something good, there is a reducal of that arousal, and that reducil of arousal leads to what? It reduces the need, and now you need to start another need. It could be social, it could be psychological, it could be physiological. So there were theories. There are approximately 9 to 12 theories. This is just the beginning. Motivation theories. This will tell you they have all the psychologists have their own idea about how motivation was a part of our living. Evolutionary approach stated that psychologists in the beginning, this is like the first approach that we have, evolutionary, one of the first, it stated that motivation is an innate characteristic of human beings. And when we talk about it's an innate, which we are born with, these behaviors, these characteristic innate behaviors that determines our biological behaviors, our psychological behavior are called instincts. And in behaviors, these instincts are what? These instincts makes you reproduce, it makes you responsible, it makes you popular, it could be for a sexual behavior also. So evolutionary will talk about continuation process, that why are we motivated? We are motivated because of a characteristic behavior which is instincts of procreating, instincts of influencing other, becoming responsible. So this is evolutionary, very basic approach by Jameson Dougall in 1908. Then we have a drive theory, which is also called the push theory. Drive theories are actually considered as something as push theories. This is one of those approaches motivation where they say that there is a need, and it creates a psychological tension. That tension drives you to reduce that need, which is like pushes you that you need to complete it. You need to complete it. This push behavior is the behavior which is pushing you towards, driving force towards anything. So it could be in anyone. It could be in an animal. It could be in human also. So let's take an example like a social strata drive theory is that at 13, 14, you need to decide your careers. Like you need to decide your subject for class 10. You need to be very sorted. So that's the tension in the mind of children. So it's pushing them. And Hull stated this tension as drive. This drive is the push drive to us. And after that, you want to move to something which is forming a particular career and taking up an occupation. After occupation, you need to settle in life. After settling in life, you need to procreate. So basic drives are also taken as drive theories. Primary drives are moving as per the drive theory. We are having some sort of motivation happens. Why? When there's a need, impending deficiency of something, there would be psychological tension. This psychological tension was considered as drive. This drive pushes you to complete it. So it's called the drive theory. The last today that we do is optimal arousal theory, very similar to Yerkes and Dodgson's theory. Simple theory. It says the model states we function best when we are moderately aroused or energized. Both high and low energies lead to low performance. That's just simple. Let's look at this image which we complete our class today with. See, it stated that moderate amount of arousal, adequate. Let's take it moderate and adequate amount of arousal. The right kind of arousal is extremely important for you to get motivated and complete a task. So Yerkes and Dirk's law says that very low arousal will not make you move, and very high arousal will make you lead to very high anxiety. Low arousal will lead to boredom, lack of interest, and high arousal will lead to too much of anxiety, euphoric mood, too much of distraction, confusion in the mind. So, what do we need? We need optimal level of arousal to feel motivated. So, as per this that we talk about, we need to know that motivation is something, it's an ability for you to complete a task. So there would be a need that will drive you. We always will feel motivated when we have an impending need within us. We will never feel motivated without that. There are different kinds of motives that we have: psychological that we did, physiological that we did, and social that we did. We started a few of the theories that tell us that how are we motivated and why are we motivated. Evolutionary approach states we are motivated because it's an innate need and it's instinctual in nature. Drive, because we have a psychological tension called drive. And the last is yes. This finishes our knowledge today, and I hope you understood motivation. We complete and we feel the drive within us, the drive to be a part of the class from now on. I hope you revise everything right from memory to motivation, and we continue with all the 10 and 11 theories that we have today. And remember, we started with evolution, came to optimal arousal. Optimal arousal last. You can always visit the page on top to understand. It's a Yatsenberg's theory which is important. So we all need to be motivated to be a part of my class next time. Thank you so much. Wish you all the best. Namaste.